Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Getting Started, the CO2 Performance Ladder for Low Carbon Procurement. This event is part of a collaboration between the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, and the Foundation for Climate-Friendly Business and Procurement, SKAO in the Dutch acronym. My name's Laura Turley. I am an associate with IISD. IISD is an award-winning and independent think tank with a bold mission to create a world where people and the planet thrive. We have 4 speakers lined up for you today who will be sharing their knowledge and insights on low carbon procurement and how to get started. We will aim to keep the session very practical, applied, and open to your questions. As you all know, we're in the midst of a climate emergency. According to the UK Met Office's report from last week, in the next 5 years, it's very likely that global temperatures will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, revealing that we're edging ever closer to a situation where 1.5 degrees could be exceeded on an extended period. In this context, it's essential that we continue to apply pressure to our systems of resource extraction and use, and heavy industry such as infrastructure is a key sector to target with our climate mitigation efforts. In this webinar, we'll be discussing the public procurement of infrastructure, which is a significant source of global carbon dioxide emissions, as governments are continuously buying, upgrading, and maintaining roads, railways, ports, buildings, water systems, waste systems, digital communication networks, and energy infrastructure. We at IISD have long since been stressing that governments use their large purchasing power strategically to advance sustainable development. And so we've been pleased to read in the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on mitigation that public procurement is explicitly mentioned as a way to bring about change. Personally, I've worked on the topic of sustainable public procurement for 10 years now, and I've been happy to see a move towards implementation, really discussion around tools, discussions around learning from the growing collection of case studies and best practice, and also by identifying different points along the procurement process where more environmental and social considerations can be integrated. At the same time, through this current collaboration with SKAO, which Maud will explain in greater detail soon, in the past few months, I've had the occasion to speak with many procuring authorities in Europe, and we've talked about the CO2 Performance Ladder. We've realized that there's still a fair bit of hesitancy to introduce new procurement practices, sometimes a lack of clarity on what's possible, what's allowed, and most often a fear of compatibility or incompatibility with procurement laws. So without further ado, today we'll be discussing the CO2 Performance Ladder, an instrument that is used extensively in public procurement in the Netherlands, where it's had a real impact in lowering CO2 emissions, and which is now also used in infrastructure procurement in Belgium. This instrument is operating successfully within the European context, which is to say, in the context of the EU Procurement Directive, and we'll learn more today from our speakers about how this works in practice. Our hope with this webinar is to support and encourage procurement officials along their SPP journey, to provide an example of recognized best practice, and to address all of your questions. We can't promise we have the answers to everything, but you can ask anyways. And I can say that there's a genuine openness and willingness from our speakers today, who I'll introduce shortly, to share and to keep it really practical and shine a light on some of the tricky issues. So please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your questions. You can introduce your name or remain anonymous, and we'll be collecting and organizing the questions as they come in to share with each of the speakers. We will see how it goes if we ask some questions at the end of a speaker's intervention or if we keep them all for the end. But in any case, please use the function and we welcome your questions and comments. In addition, the webinar will be recorded. It will be recorded, and we will eventually compile a written follow-up document for you with questions and answers and any resources that come up during the webinar today. So I'd now like to pass the floor over to our first speaker. We have Maud Vospinder from the Foundation for Climate-Friendly Business and Procurement, SKAO. She's a project manager at SKAO, and this is the organization that owns and manages the CO2 Performance Ladder. So she's going to help us set the scene today and explain what it is we're talking about. Over to you, Maud.
Thank you, Laura, and hi, everyone. So my name is Maud Vospinder, and while I speak, I will try to share my screen with you. So today I'm going to explain what the CO2 Performance Ladder is. So maybe it's good to start with the question, why green public procurement? And as already Laura mentioned in our introduction, a lot of, I'm sorry, my screen isn't working. So
I saw your screen.
Yeah, but it didn't move forward, so
okay. Let's try again.
Sorry for that. But so as Laura already mentioned, we are the owner and administrator of the CO2 Performance Ladder. So today we have a webinar where we emphasizes a lot of best practices for the users of the CO2 Performance Ladder, and I will start by giving a brief introduction about the instrument. So let's try this again. Yes, I think it's working now.
It is.
Good. Happy to see that. So if you just briefly look at the question, why green public procurement, as Laura already mentioned, there's a lot of spend and money going into this and a lot of power. So what we mean is that European governments in general, they spend 14% of their GDP up to procurement. And then 15% of the global carbon emissions are caused by procurement. And there are, of course, different kind of categories and tenders you can apply procurement with and tenders. And if we look more closely to the more different kind of categories and their climate impact, then infrastructural sector and construction far out is the most carbon expensive sector. So almost 80% of all the global carbon emissions are caused by this sector. So it makes sense that governments like ministries or municipalities, they use their power to make impact. And we like to call that the power of procurement. And this is actually the whole process and principle on which the CO2 Performance Ladder was developed. I best can explain our instrument by this infographic. So if you see on the left hand, procuring parties like municipalities, they can use our instrument as a green public procurement tool. And if they do so, they give an award advantage to companies. And by doing that, they really stimulate decarbonization and innovation, not only in the companies, but also in their project, their supply chains, and therefore heavy industries. For companies, this is a really interesting model to apply because they get an award advantage. So this is a carrot in this whole system and not a stick. They are stimulated in a positive way. So it's actually a green business case for companies to work with the CO2 Performance Ladder. And for procuring parties, this is really easy to apply. And it's actually, I really think, the easiest way to make significant impact through procurement. Then the organization behind the CO2 Performance Ladder is SKAO. That's the organization where I work for. And it's a Dutch abbreviation, and it can be translated to the Foundation for Climate-Friendly Procurement and Business. And we are an independent, not-for-profit NGO. And what we do is we like to include and inform all the stakeholders that work with our instrument. So on the one hand, those are the procuring parties, but also we like to inform and include companies and different kind of experts. And actually together, we manage and develop the CO2 Performance Ladder. So this is not a new system. It's been around for almost 13 years. And at this moment, there are over 200 public procuring parties in the Netherlands and in Belgium that use our instrument as a green public procurement tool. And by doing so, they stimulate a lot of organizations to get certified. So at this moment, because of that, there are over 1,250 certificate issued. I'm sorry, there's a construction worker here. I don't know if you hear this. There are 5,000 organizations certified at this moment because it's possible to have multiple organizations on one certificate. And more than 75% of these organizations are actually the smaller to the medium-sized enterprises. So this is not only an instrument that can be applied to larger and bigger companies. So what I have said is this is actually the standard green public procurement tool in the Netherlands and Belgium. And it is a proven concept. It has been working very well in the last 13 years without any really big problems, also not legal problems. That's also due because this instrument and the whole GPP part is already aligned with the European Procurement Directive. So as Laura already mentioned, at this moment, we are really busy trying to see if we can disseminate our instrument throughout Europe. So we have a project together, and it's funded by the IKEA Foundation. And this is a really big feasibility project where we are focusing at this moment in 10 different kind of countries in the Netherlands, in Europe, to see if there are opportunities to disseminate our instruments. So if you are interested and you are working in Europe, and it doesn't have to be in one of those 10 countries, but if you are interested in our instrument, you can always contact us to see if there are opportunities to use this instrument and to see what the opportunities for you are. So when we explain our instrument, it's really good to make a distinction between either the carbon management system on the one hand, and when we talk about the carbon management system, this is actually the part for organizations to get certified on. So you can get certified on 1 or 5 levels if you implement also a plan to check X cycle and you meet the requirements. And on the other hand, you can see the CO2 Performance Ladder as a procurement tool. And if doing so, and if using it as a GPP tool, procuring parties, they give an award advantage to companies. The higher a company is certified, the more award advantage they get, but also the more carbon they reduce. So what does it mean then to get certified? If an organization wants to get certified, they have to implement a carbon management system, and they have to meet requirements. And this is all yearly assessed by a third party, an accredited third party, and they check every company every year. The requirements we have, it's like a 4-step methodology, and it starts with having knowledge about how much carbon you emit, so having a footprint. When you do have that knowledge, then you get and you set reduction targets, and they have to be ambitious. You have to be transparent and communicate about this. So everything I just mentioned, you have to also publish online and also your progress. And finally, you have to collaborate with your sector and with your supply chain to make even more impact. The requirements we have, they are based on international standards. So if you already have an ISO footprint, you can directly imply that into our instrument. The differences between the levels is up until level 3. An organization has this all for their scope 1 and their scope 2 emissions, or that means the emissions of your organization and everything you do in projects. And if you are certified on level 4 or 5, you also include your scope 3 emissions. So those are your supply chain and your industry emissions. Then very briefly look into the whole procurement part of the instrument, and I just say very briefly because I think you will hear a lot of details about how this works from the 2 procuring parties that are after me. Let me just start by mentioning that we, as SKAO, we have developed a procurement guide. And in this procurement guide, which is translated, it's open access already on our website, there's a step-by-step explanation how you can use the CO2 Performance Ladder in tenders. I think the only thing I would like to mention here is to emphasize the whole carrot thing again, is that if a company enters the tender and does their bid, at that moment, they don't have to be certified on the CO2 Performance Ladder. They promise, or they make an ambition into one of the 5 levels, which are in line with the 5 levels of the certification. So there's where the reward advantage is already calculated. And if they win the bid, then they are obligated to get certified and to be committed on the CO2 Performance Ladder. So this is a voluntary system for companies. They can choose their own ambition level, or they can just choose not to participate with the CO2 Performance Ladder, and then they will not get that award advantage. So it's voluntarily. And let me just finish with this slide. This is a lot of information. So these are some advantages for companies that implement a management system, but also for the procuring parties. I think in general, it's really good to mention again that this is a proven methodology. It really works. A lot of carbon is actually reduced. Organizations that are certified, they reduce twice as fast than average. For them, the biggest advantage is that it's a green business case, so they have a financial advantage and competitive advantage in tenders. And for the procuring part, it is already in accordance with the European directive, so no legal issues there. And you don't have to have knowledge about how sustainable an organization is, because the whole assessment for organizations, that's been done for you because of the whole certification part of the CO2 Performance Ladder. So this is the CO2 Performance Ladder in a nutshell. As you can imagine, because we are active for 13 years already, if you go to our website, you can find so much more information, best practices, guidelines, animations, everything you need to get started. But if you like to get started and you would like to see what kind of opportunities we have in Europe, please contact us because that's where we're for. So thank you very much, Laura.
Thanks so much, Maud. It was great to set the scene and to learn more about the tool and the instrument and exactly how it works. I think we're going to move right along now to Mr. Harold Versteeg, Program Manager at Rijkswaterstaat, the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management from the Netherlands. So Rijkswaterstaat is a large client of infrastructure, a large buyer, and they've also been using this particular instrument in procurement for quite some time. So we're really keen to hear about this experience and some of the technicalities of how you put this into place. So Harold, over to you. Thanks so much.
Unmuting is nicer. Thank you, Laura. I have too many sheets, so I will rush through the first part, but I really want to tell the introduction as well. So, and if there are any questions, don't hesitate, please. Because the main message that I want to make, I will just spoil it already in the beginning, is it is an easy and very effective way to do procurement if you are an organization, if you work for an organization that has a carbon ambition. But it's not just something you do completely separate of the rest of the organization. It needs to be part of a strategy. And one of the first things, it's not necessary because we didn't do it either in the beginning, but it really does help if you get the certificate yourself, or if you work in the same way, you don't even have to get the certificate. But if you do all the things that you have to do to get the certificate, then you get the insight, and then things just fit and you profit much more of it. My name is Harold Versteeg. That was mentioned already. I work for the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. At the time that this all started for me, I was the program manager of our sustainability program. And the organization that I work for is the agency within the ministry that deals with the waterworks, the shipping channels, and the roads. So it's the Road Authority, the Waterway Authority, and also the organization that manages the main water channels in our country. So we spend yearly about 4 to 5 billion euros on infrastructure. And we started using the Carbon Performance Ladder already for 13 years. So I put in the wrong date, but we're using it now for 13 years already. And we helped to get this whole system up and running. And it started because the rail authority had invented this system. Then our Director General met with the Director General of the railroad people, and they said, well, we have something that works really well. And then our Director General said, well, then maybe we can use it as well. And then suddenly it started to grow, and something like SKAO that is now managing the whole system is really necessary, because we want it to be it has to be something from the whole sector, not just from the buyers. At the moment, it is just as much from the whole industry as it is from the government. We started with dredging works. We started also with road maintenance. But already quickly after that, we introduced it in all works and all engineering contracts. And even in other types of tendering, like the information technology tenders for installations, whatever. We are certified ourselves at level 5. So this is not a voluntary system. Everyone that does a tender in the field of infrastructure is obligated to put this in the contract documentation. And why is that? Because we have an ambition that is quite high. This is our sustainability ambition. Spatial planning part, I will forget. The circular economy part has, of course, a bit overlap with the carbon reduction, because sometimes measures work for both. But for today, it's important to focus on the energy and the climate ambition. We want to be climate neutral in 2030. So that means that the building, the maintaining of the infrastructure, not the use of the infrastructure by the cars and the ships, but the part that we do and the part that our contractors do should be climate neutral. So many things have to change. And that's why we believe in a system like the Carbon Performance Ladder that makes our suppliers think about how are we going to help the ministry to reach their goals. Because that is why we do green sustainable procurement. We want to make them think about what is important for us. So as Maud already showed, the carrot and the stick, we believe in both the carrot and the stick have a function. Whereas in the European guidelines of the minimum quality requirements, that's what we consider the sticks, things you have to do. That is nice, that makes it impossible for the really bad people to sell us their really bad products. But we want to have the carrot there, that if you are really clever and you do more, so if you are an innovative company, you have optimized process, you have invested in clean materials, in clean processes, then we want to be able to give you more work than if you are an old-fashioned company that is not taking carbon into account. So I cannot enough stress the importance of having a strategy. So this is not something you do as a hobby. You have to know where to start. So don't do it in every kind of contract. It may end up like we did, doing all the works. But if you're starting, choose the purchases where you think this is the type of contract, that's where we want to start. And then you have to discuss that with your suppliers, because you need scale. If it's only one tender a year, then the industry is not interested in this. So you have to be able to offer them a scale, both just so it's a volume, and also in time. You have to promise them sort of continuity. We will do this not just for 1 or 2 projects. No, we are going to do this in that type of contracts for at least 5 years, and we will always do it. Then you interest the industry to move into this system. Because we have seen, if they start to invest in innovation and making their processes less carbon intensive, it just takes time. So we have seen them investing, and the carbon emissions, they go down quickly. The first step, usually 15 to 20%, is easy. After that, they really have to work on it. So as I mentioned, we want them to think about reaching our goal. So it's carbon neutral in 2030. So we want them to think not only about opening and closing bridges. So the things they build have to be energy efficient. We also want them to think about the materials they procure, the steel, the cement. We want them to think about how they make the constructions, the roads. But we also want them to think, can we influence the carbon emissions of traffic? Can we implement energy production in the designs that we are making of the sluices, the locks, the roads, whatever? So this is the whole scope that we would like them to think of. And as I mentioned, if you get the certificate yourself as a ministry, then you get this sort of insight. We know that the carbon that is being emitted by our suppliers is mostly by dragging soil and sand around. Earthworks, just digging, put it in a truck, driving around. Then asphalt, then dredging on the coast, concrete and steel. So this sort of insight really helps you to focus, where should we start? Which types of contracts should we put this in first? And then, only after that, then you start thinking about selection criteria, awarding criteria, and contract specifications. So this now we're getting towards for the procurement people, their world. So the basic procedure is, I think, in the ideal situation, that you use functional specifications. So the more freedom you give to the contractor, the more options they have to optimize, and they can then pick the best things from a carbon perspective. All the decisions also should be based on life cycle costing, the total cost of ownership. If you do that, then automatically they start thinking about, then we do it a little bit differently. And usually that is in a more sustainable way as well. And only after that, you look at the contract specification. And for instance, we have contract specifications for asphalt and for concrete. We have a limit on the environmental footprint of those materials. But also on top of that, we have award criteria for these same asphalt and concrete. And like for if you build a tunnel, we said the tunnel cannot use more than this amount of energy. And there will be probably on the award, so that's a minimum contract specification. There will also then be an award criteria, but if you use less energy or make it even climate neutral, then you'll have more chance of getting the contract. We have two basic award criteria. It's a carbon performance ladder and another system, which I won't go into today, the Dubocalc, but that's where we have the specifications on the materials and the construction. So Maud already explained it, and it's really important to understand it is almost like it's two separate worlds. No, it is not almost, it is two separate worlds. The things an organization has to do to get a certain certificate, all that has to do with the organization. And now the lawyers are already thinking, oh, that's not allowed, that's not allowed, that's not allowed. Yes, if you look at it's a carbon management system, totally outside of the procurement world. We want to have an organization thinking about how can I reduce the carbon levels within my organization, with the projects that we're doing within our own organization. And next to it is a procurement system. That is where we never obligate an organization to get a certificate. It is completely voluntary that an organization says, oh, by the way, the things you are asking of me at the project level, can I use the carbon performance ladder as a proof that I'm doing that at the project level? So at the project level, we only ask things that we are allowed to ask within the European guidelines. Why do we love this system? Because never ever in this system is described the technical measures that an organization has to take, because it is impossible for a procurement organization to think of everything, of the materials, of design, of logistics. The people that do the design and make the projects, they have to start thinking about what is important for us. So it only helps them to think of the measures that they can take to reduce carbon emissions. And there is no list that they have to tick boxes. Like in many of the European guidelines, the minimum criteria, that's all things you have to do. That's like the sticks. Within the certification process for the carbon performance ladder, there's only a process written, but the questions they have to ask themselves, not the answers to the question. So they have to think, what can I do to reduce the emissions? What are my competitors doing? What are my main emissions? So they have to look for what other people are doing, and they have to explain why they cannot implement it, or they have to find a way to implement something new. So that's why we like this. It doesn't have an obligation at the buyer side to think of all the main sustainability measures. So how does it work? Maud explained it already, but I will explain again. In a tender procedure, we have here still written 5, but we use only level 3, 4, and 5. We have 3 levels of carbon emission. There's only things that we ask at the project level. So they have to do, for this project, we want you to do, you can choose at the level 3, you have to do these things. Then voluntarily, they offer to do it at the level 3, level 4, or level 5. Then we give an award bonus, 3%, 4%, or 5%. And then, of course, during the execution of the project, they have to prove to us that they did all that at the project level. If a company is only doing one project, we don't think they will go for the carbon performance ladder certificate. They will prove that to us just in the one project. But most of the companies will do more projects. And then it is easier for them to choose the carbon performance ladder as a proof instead of doing it project by project. That is just more work. That's the way it's designed. So that's how it works, and that's why you can call it the trick, that we don't ask for the certificates. We never make it obligated to use it, but it's their choice to use an instrument. That there are some things in the certificate that we are not allowed to ask as a buyer. But if, on the other hand, a company chooses voluntarily to use a certificate, then they accept that these extra things are in there. And we think that's a good thing, because it's all the things that we like them to do. Have I explained all of this? Yes, the incentives is on the project, and then they use a certificate that is for them the most efficient way to use as a proof. So just my conclusion is, this is very cost effective, because we know from companies that have started doing the performance ladder, they have discovered that they could save money, a lot of money, when they started looking at the energy use of their own installations, their own logistics, whatever. So this is not the case where it's costing more. This is the case of discovering, getting the insight, and where can you save money. That's mostly the case. It's also very low risk, because we are not prescribing what they have to do. We are just prescribing them to ask themselves questions. So they will start using their brains, and they have come up over the last 13 years with really clever things. The costs have not risen, at least we haven't been able to prove it, or that it's not visible. So we think it's very cost effective. It is low risk, and the discussion whether it's legal or not, it just isn't there anymore. The only discussion that sometimes pops up, could we make it simpler and use it as a selection criteria? But until now, we haven't gone into it. We think using it as an award criterion is still functional. It works. That's what I wanted to tell.
Harold, thank you very much for explaining it, how it's used by Rijkswaterstaat, the CO2 Performance Ladder, how it's used in an optional way to award an advantage to companies, and very specifically to specific elements of the project itself as a type of proof. We have 3 questions here for you. I think we should try to get through them quickly because they're all quite related to just your specific presentation, or at least a couple of them. Maybe just to start with the most recent, just because it's the most linked to your last points. It was about accepting other forms of proof or other labels that prove performance, other science-based targets.
Well, the problem is, you have to prove that you're doing something at that specific project.
Mm-hmm.
So you cannot just tell us, well, basically as a company, we are doing things really well. No, you have to be able to show what have you been doing at the project. So what happens if the certifying organization comes into a company, then they are checking whether the company as a whole has implemented the system, but he's also checking whether the company has done everything that is obligated at the project level, where they are using the certificate as proof.
Indeed, an important part of this tool instrument is the third party.
Yeah, and the third party is really not checking all the projects, but it is sort of blind picking a number of projects from the list of projects that they use the certificate as proof, and then at the project level is really the check whether the organization has implemented all the measures at the project level. Otherwise, we would not accept the certificate as proof of the carbon performance level we ask at the project. So it is that is the thing that people sometimes have difficulty understanding. And it is also sometimes difficult to explain that although the certificate is on the organization level, it has been designed in a way that if the organization uses the certificate as proof, then there will be extra checks from the third party to see whether they have implemented it really until the project level. And that's why we can accept it.
Okay, thanks very much. We have a question about how you define ambition levels and exactly like in terms of emissions reduction. So how do you know that you have an ambitious target? And then related to that is, how do you know that this level is not going to hamper all the competition? It's not going to eliminate the, drastically the number of companies who are able to bid.
There are several places, I think, where we use the ambition level. That there is at the level of the in the tender procedure, there are 3 levels of ambition that the company chooses, and those are process levels. So that there's never a written number of the amount of carbon that they have to reduce. It is more like, how complicated are you going to make how important are you going to make it in your process? So there it is. So if they, for instance, say, I'm going for level 5, then they also promise that they are doing innovation in the project, and that they are going to cooperate with their own supply chain. If they're only offering it at level 3, then they say, we're only looking at our own emissions, we're not looking at the emissions of our suppliers. So that is something we just offer. We offer them the choice in the tender documents of these 3 levels. And then they say, I will do the project at level 5 or at level 4 or at level 3. So so there you don't have the problem of competition, because anyone can choose the same, and no one has to have the certificates at the beginning of the project, as long as they do the project at that level. So you can start with it in the first project. Then there is no. The other question is, when you are looking at the organization level, and is an organization ambitious or not? That is the hardest question of all, and that we are always trying to improve that. From the beginning, there are several ways of helping an auditor to judge whether an organization is ambitious, because you can look at its competitors. So we want organizations themselves to describe why they think they have an ambitious goal. And they can use then, of course, just the insight, we are doing things our competitors are not doing. They can compare, if you're an asphalt company, and you can, my products are more sustainable than the products of my competitors. So that is the way they have to explain that and they have to explain it in several ways. They have to explain it to the auditor. But within the system, there's also a thing that is really annoying for organizations. They have to talk to an NGO about their ambitions, and then they get all sorts of nasty questions. Because so if they just have some nice greenwashed story about their ambitious organization, and if you just know a little bit about the sector and you think, but other people are doing much, much more, and why don't you stop doing this? Those questions then become part of the auditing process. So like Maud said, the communication and the making things visible, everything they do on carbon, they have to publish online. So it is completely visible for the whole world that an organization says, oh, look at me, I'm really ambitious. And then you go into detail, what are you doing? But your competitors are doing much more. So then it becomes easier for an auditor to start the discussion whether they deserve a level 4 or level 5 or level 3. Because you have to prove that you are an ambitious organization if you want to be at level 5 or level 4.
Okay, thanks very much, Harold. And I hope we have time to come back to that topic. We also have another question about more the organizational management side of things. But for the sake of time, we're going to go to our next presentation. I'm keeping track of all these questions. But I would like to introduce you now to our third speaker, who is Mr. Dirk van Trooijen. And he is a road structures engineer from the Flemish Road and Traffic Agency, AWV. He is a road measurement engineer by training, and he's involved with many different GPP projects for his agency. So I'd like to welcome Dirk to share now. And again, I will keep track of the questions, keep them coming, questions and comments, very welcome. And anything we're not able to get to today, we will try to provide written answers for afterwards.
Thank you, Laura. So thank you for the introduction. I don't know as much as Harald about the performance ladder since we've only been working with it for a couple of years. But I'll tell you what our experiences were. So yeah, first some context. We've had a couple of climate actions in the past and in the future in Flanders, but not every one of them was very strong. But I think there's the support for more and stronger sustainability measures is increasing in the last couple of years. The introduction of the ladder was not done by us, but it was done by VBA in 2017. It's an association of the Belgian building industry. So they launched a steering group, hired CO2 Logic, and in the steering group there were Belgian governments were all represented, contractors. SKAO was there to guide everything and to advise. Everything went well in working groups. Some legal and technical things were tackled, and eventually some Belgian text and clauses were created for the Belgian legal context, of course. There's a website from the Belgian CO2 Performance Ladder, and the emission factors from Belgium are online as well if you want to check that. So in 19, then the governments of the Flemish, Walloon and Brussels regions, not the federal government. If you know Belgium a little bit, you know that we have a lot of governments. So they decided that we would have a pilot phase, initially 3 years, but it was extended to 4 years. If the phase was positive, then there would be a broad introduction in the Belgian regions, again, not the federal. And there would be the construction of a Belgian SKAO company and other companies that were needed to have the Belgian situation. So there were 10 pilots in Flanders, 10 in Wallonia, and 5 in Brussels. At the moment, we have 8 in Flanders and 12 in Wallonia, so we're actually there, but we haven't just reached the 10 in Flanders yet. I think there are 5 or 4 in Brussels. And of course, the certifying bodies were also in the steering group, and they were also trained by SKAO and by BELAC to certify. Yeah. Legally, the handbook and other documents were adapted and translated into French. There were Belgian tender clauses. And of course, we work with 2 award criteria. I think it's the same in Holland, price and CO2 ambition level. We had to make some changes to the levels you could use. Actually, you can enter the competition with a level 5, but it would not give you more advantage than a level 3. And this is actually to protect the market, the Belgian market, because a lot of Dutch companies have level 4 and 5, and the Belgian companies are just starting out. So we limit to level 3, and 2 for 6% is the standard. If you possess a certificate, it's only verified after 1 year, just like in Holland. And in Belgium, it's the case that contractors often use subcontractors to install signalization and other things, maybe small bits of asphalt. And we decided that they also need to have the same ambition level as the main contractors. I want to talk about the Antwerp pilot project. That's the first project we did in Belgium, in Flanders, on the Scheldelaan. That's in the harbor of Antwerp, port of Antwerp. It cost 4.5 million. Took 6 months. We had to make a little adjustment to the clauses, since the clauses say, yeah, you have to have your certificate after 1 year, but here you have to just we had to adjust it to 6 months, or just when the project is finished, because otherwise you cannot pay the contractor until 6 months after the project is finished. So we couldn't do that. So we had to make this adjustment. The project leader chose to have 1 to 3% as the fictional reductions instead of 2, 4, 6, because he was a bit scared that if things went wrong, that then the fines would be too high, this large amounts, and yeah, he was afraid that many couldn't reach the ambition level. Of course, he wasn't. His fear was not just, because it was all candidates had ambition level 3. There were different candidates, so it was all right. The evaluation of the whole thing, the whole phase. Of course, we are also doing other pilot projects at the moment, but I decided to only talk about this, the first one. We're moving on quite well. Some things that were not that great at first. The finance inspector, above a certain amount in Flanders and in Belgium, you have to approve your tender. At the finance inspector goes across the details, the legal details, and he said, yeah, it's not clear. These award criteria, do they apply to the subject? I think that's what Harold was talking about. Wasn't very clear. He said, okay, I'll allow it, but I hope that one day someone will take it to court and they will solve it there. So yeah, we're not out of the woods yet. And another thing that the contractor submitted this project dossier as stated in the handbook, but it was a bit unclear for us and for the project leader. What do we have to do with it? Do we have to evaluate it? So yeah, we're not in Belgium. We're not that used to having a great dialogue between contractor and government. So that's, I think, in the Netherlands that happens more often, not always, but more often than here. So that's, yeah, we need to increase that dialogue about these sustainability measures that the contractor does. Some other points. There were plenty of candidates. They were all large companies, of course, because we decided to go for a large projects in this pilot phase. So that's the consequence, is that small companies are probably lagging behind at this moment. That's something we have to give attention to after the pilot phase, if you go forth with it or not. We see that contenders always seem to go for a company level certificate, not a project level. Actually, we saw it once and then he changed his mind and went for a company level. I think that's the easiest for everyone in the end. Yeah, we had no questions from companies to us, so maybe they asked it straight to SKAO, or they just didn't have questions. Maybe it was all very clear, so we don't know about that. And some positive points are that the procurer, he can always change the conditions of in the tender to his liking in other countries, perhaps. So you could use different award criteria. You could use points instead of fictional reduction. You could adjust the fines, or you could even demand a minimum ambition level. Actually, we saw it even before we launched the pilot phase. There were 2 or 3 tenders already that just demanded the minimum ambition level of 5 even in Antwerp. So that was odd, but okay, you can do that. And we saw that it's not much work for the project leader. It's true. You could just copy paste some clauses, adapt some things perhaps. It did need a bit of training. We need more webinars in the future. So you'll see more of these probably. And it's also a big advantage that the burden of proof is on the contractor, and that not the procurer needs to go after the contractor all the time, and it's always a lot of work asking for documents, and you can't move on without the documents. No, the burden of proof is on the contractor, so that's a lot less work for us and annoyance. And no extra cost for us. We saw this in the prices; they were all reasonable and normal. And in the end, we can conclude that it's a clear impulse for companies to use more sustainability measures. We can clearly see that they're thinking more about these actual things that they can do on the wharf or in the plants. So that's a very, very positive thing in the end. If there's any questions, I'd like to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dirk. This has just been really concrete lessons from the pilots in Belgium. So for example, there's this difference maybe in Belgium and the Netherlands about pre-procurement dialogue. So how can it be kind of adapted where that's less the norm? I think the Dutch are kind of famous for that. That you focused on these large projects in your pilots. So maybe to avoid initial concerns about disadvantaging small companies. Yep. That you focused on levels 1 to 3 to encourage, again, companies to invest without needing to go to level 4 or 5 yet. That link to subject matter, for example, is still a work in progress, but we've seen how it's worked in the Netherlands. So we're hopeful in this context, and that it's been relatively easy to use. There is a pretty specific question for you. One is this a mandatory certification in Belgium? And secondly, why are there pilots in Wallonia, but not elsewhere in Belgium where there might be more infrastructure going on at the moment? So why Wallonia, in your opinion, as well? So 2 questions for you before we move on.
Yeah, the last question about why there are more pilots in Wallonia, I think, yeah, my job is to watch over the condition of the roads in Flanders. So it's nothing to do with sustainability, and maybe in Wallonia they have a guy that does sustainability. We don't have that, so I don't always have a lot of time to look for projects, and there's only one person in the Flemish government who also looks for but I have to look for the Flanders, for the infrastructure projects. So yeah, and also we have had some problems with we plan a pilot project, and just the week before publication, the minister is looking over this project, and we don't want it to go wrong. So then the head of the division just says, no, we're not going to do it. And it's happened 3 or 4 times already. So yeah, it's a bit difficult. Maybe I don't know why Wallonia it's going better, but yeah, that's my experience. Also, one other thing is that often with large projects, there's not just one contractor. Like Aquafin is often involved, and others. So, and sometimes one time Aquafin didn't want it, and yeah, it was cancelled again. So we had some bad luck.
Thank you. And I think then to just complement in terms of that first question, I think through these pilots, it's been being used as an optional award criteria, just like it's used in the Netherlands. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can enter the competition with ambition level 0. That's no problem, if that's the question, I think.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, thanks very much, Dirk. I'm going to pass to our final speaker, who is Mr. Frankie Vandenberg. A leading player on the Belgian market, Willemen Infrastructure wants to be an example for CO2 reductions in the sector. The company's sustainability policy is translated into practice through using the CO2 Performance Ladder. And our speaker, Frankie Vandenberg, is a sustainability manager at Willemen Group, and he will give an explanation on how they've obtained, so we see from now the company side, how they obtained level 4 on the CO2 Performance Ladder and how they use it in responding to public tenders. So Frankie, over to you. I believe we're going to start with a short video.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I will start with a small company video from 1 minute. Okay. I have a technical problem with my screen. 1 moment. So.
While we're waiting, there's no problem, take your time. Maud, I was wondering if you wanted to address the question about what happens if a contractor, if a company who has pledges they will meet a certain level of the certificate of the ladder does not fulfill these CO2 commitments?
Yeah, that's a good question. So obviously there's a fee if a company doesn't meet the criteria and doesn't get certified and cannot prove that they're actually sustainable. So it's up to the contracting authority to define the fee, but we advise that they use 1.5 times as much as the award advantage they got. So the fee is significant. Or the fine. I'm just.
There's a fine. There's a financial penalty if the company does not.
There's
1 year
penalty.
later during the audit, they do not meet the level they said.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we'll pass it back over. Thanks so much to Frankie.
Thank you, Lara. So I will start the film. So I switch now to my presentation. So I'm back on track. Willemen Group consists of different companies that are divided into clusters, which are subdivided into business cluster. So by dividing our group into clusters and business lines, we remove unnecessary barriers and we realize a lot of synergies and are able to profile ourselves towards the market. In this presentation, I will do the implementation of the CO2 Performance Ladder, and I've done it with the following 4 questions. Now, Willemen Infra has started with level 3 and in 2020, and 1 year later, they went to level 4. In 2023, level 5 is planned. How did we collect the data? For this, we have to make an inventory of all energy flows and draw up an emission inventory. The latter is then the CO2 footprint. First of all, we have to determine our organizational boundary. And we use for that the greenhouse gas protocol, in which these emissions are divided in different scopes. So we have scope 1, that are direct emissions. The sources which Willemen Infra emits itself, that's consumption of the fleet, the natural gas for our installations and heating, and the fuel oil. my presentation start to move himself. So our scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions and include the use of gray electricity or green electricity of non-Belgian origin. For the CO2 performance ladder, we have to include all emissions from scope 1 and 2, as well as the business travel from scope 3. Based on the organizational structure, we make an inventory of the emission sources, fill in the units of the reported period, and multiply them by an emission factor. The links to the emission factor you can see in the presentation, and calculating the relevant footprint and drawing up reports can be done in various ways. It can be done in an Excel, or you can make use of an online Excel package. So since Willemen has a complex structure, we have chosen to do it with smart trackers. Smart trackers also offers the advantage that you can use it also for assessments and internal audits. The footprint of Willemen Infra was subsequently determined via this smart trackers platform, and the equipment consumption is mainly fuel oil for machines and power groups. Company cars is mostly diesel, and half of the footprints come from asphalt production. So measures as the asphalt plants will have the biggest impact. Yeah, how to determine actions? Now that we know the footprint and where it comes from, we have to look how we can determine measures to achieve a CO2 reduction and also determine a reduction objective. And for asphalt production, we have based ourselves on existing best available studies and listing each plant in relation to their energy saving measure described. For the asphalt plants, existing reports could be used to monitor energy consumption in relation to the quantity of asphalt produced. But for concrete plants, the exercise is more complicated, as some of the concrete plants are temporary in nature. It's not always possible to have a permanent grid connection for them. Also, mobile crushers are used in these sites, which is also usually the work of a subcontractor. So in order to get a good picture of that exact energy consumption on such sites, we need to keep separate records. For the reduction potential of offices, we need to take into account whether they are owned or rented, and an energy scan is carried out for each office, which measures are cataloged in quick wins, medium term, and longer term. On this slide, you can find examples of reductions at our yard, material and equipment, and mobility. You can see for energy efficient offices, the Belgian green electricity, the use of battery packs, also electrification of machines, measuring hours, standstill hours, operating hours for the machinery, and then the switch to electric hybrid vehicles, the telework, flexible offices, and training of the people. How is an objective set? Once the actions have been determined, their impact on the footprints is assessed and a reduction is defined. Our reduction is determined for a period of 3 years. So Willemen Infra, the largest part of the reduction is expected from the switch to the Belgian green electricity, together with the optimization of the best available technology study. And the use of more and more low temperature asphalt. Optimization of logistic, renewal of equipment, and maximum utilization of fixed electricity connections provide additional reductions. How are procedures and internal controls set up? Like in the previous presentation, the CO2 performance ladder has plan, do, check, act elements. So we can find a link within existing processes. a link with the process ISO 14001, the environmental management system, is included in the environmental aspect register, where actions are linked to aspects related to energy or mobility, and other elements you can find in the integration of internal audits, the management review, and the communication plan. So a communication plan is also a major part of the CO2 performance ladder, and ensures you that there is transparency, of that there is a guarantee of transparency. This is recorded for both internal and external communication, and is based on stakeholder analysis, where they are scaled according to their influence and their importance. And depending on where those stakeholders are in the quadrant, the frequency content of the communication is determined there. On the right side, you have some examples of specific communications, toolboxes, newsletters, and a lot of compulsory documents must be placed on the website from Willem and Infra themselves, also on the website of SKAO, such as the CO2 footprint reduction objective, communication messages, and so on. From level 4, the transparency is level is a little bit higher. We need to have a dialogue for an opportunity to get expert input on our approach. Structurally, it means that you conduct both dialogues at least twice a year. Is a dialogue with an NGO or an independent expert should be conducted also at the management level. And the last approach is the participation, where we ensure that we actively participate into CO2 reduction initiatives within our sector. An example of the participation in the sector is our sector organization ADEP VBA, like Dirk has mentioned, who started with the CO2 performance ladder. So as a large company, we must structurally take in the initiative also for development projects, so that new measures to further reduce CO2 emissions in scope 1, 2, or 3 are available for application in the sector, and to realize innovations. And this is also the project plan. We were Willem and Infra has done the work from the first pilot project. And what have we achieved there? We used green Belgian electricity. We reuse material, so 10% of the old road surface is reused, and we have mixed it with new material and milling it with cement, so less transports are carried out, and the use of asphalt with reduced temperature. The automatic start. The lessons learned for that is it's a good tool to encourage taking sustainable measures. The sustainability became more prominent on the agenda of Willem Group, and we have more involvement of employees on the workplace in our policy. The chain analysis during the upgrade from level 3 to 4, influence from outside the organization must be included. So a number of additional requirements are added into the 4 perspectives that was described in the beginning of this webinar. This concerns information about chain analysis, scope 3 analysis, and specific transparency and participation requirements. So chain analysis means that the CO2 footprint, that the CO2 emissions of a certain product or service are calculated for the entire chain. The whole chain means the entire life cycle of a product, from the extraction of the raw material to the end of the cycle. And the aim is to identify opportunities for CO2 reduction and to define and monitor reduction targets. We have made one chain analysis about the entire life cycle of asphalt and one about the application of fuel oil in equipment and machines. Here we zoom in on the chain analysis of asphalt. So we have based our calculation on the amount of raw materials purchased and the production by Willem Infra in 2020. On the basis of this chain description from each step, it was determined how much CO2 is emitted during the various phases of the chain. And each paragraph of the chain analysis describes a part of the chain and its associated CO2 emissions. The summary table and graph show that 40% of the CO2 emissions are due to asphalt production, with bitumen dominating the raw materials. So to determine the reduction options in scope 3 of this chain, we have calculated the CO2 emissions for all steps, and we have described the reduction options for the various steps and determined the reduction target on that basis. So Willem Infra wants to achieve this reduction on the one hand by producing more asphalt sustainable, and on the other hand by reducing the transport in the supply of raw materials. So with our level 4 certificate, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frankie. And I think we've learned a lot about the company side of things, thanks to this presentation. Certainly how in your industry, it's really, you obtain the certification thanks to hard work in a very material sense in improving asphalt production and lowering greenhouse gas emissions from asphalt production. And we've also heard from him about this transition from level 3 to level 4 and how that really requires, from a company perspective, an extra layer of consideration of the supply chain and going to, looking further down supply chains. So I would like to just take the time that we have now to go through some of the questions that have come up in the chat box and also in the Q&A function. I wanted to go back first of all to you, Harold, who there was a question early on in the chat more about kind of organizational management, I think, at Rijkswaterstaat, and wanting to know maybe who defines the questions that you use in your request for proposals, and how is this aligned with maybe broader category management strategy?
The questions that we ask at the tender documents, they're also made with SKAO. So we have standard texts that everyone can use that we know are aligned with the certificate, so that you know if you ask this, then the certificate is acceptable as proof. So if people start making their own little lists and think, oh, I'll add a little bit and change it a little bit, then things get shaky, because then it might not fit anymore. So we have standard. So next to there's a whole list of things an organization has to do to get the certificate. That is for the certification scheme. And then for public buyers, there's also a set of contract texts. That's the documents that Maud showed. So the procurement guide, there are standardized text in there, several levels of carbon emission, and those are the same. So it's good that you ask, how does it fit with the different sectors? The interesting thing is that this is so generalized. The whole system is not specifically written for the dredging industry or the road building industry or the building of hospitals. It is written in a way that an organization has to ask certain questions within their own organization, within their field, and these questions are generic. So that's the clever thing that we, and sometimes of course we do have, oh, now we see insurance companies also adopting this. Does that mean that the questions are still generic, or should we change something? So, but the ambition is really to keep it generic, that people don't have to really think about making their own adjustments for their own market.
Okay, thanks very much. A question that's come up twice from different participants is, again, this question about auditing. And I'd like to welcome maybe anyone on our panel to respond to it, or several people, because it's this question about auditing carbon emissions. With this particular instrument, it seems we're not really in the business of auditing absolute amounts of carbon emissions. So it's a different approach. And could you say more about that? Maybe start with Harold. You seem to be nodding, and anyone else who'd like to jump in.
And I'm always thinking how I can make people a bit crazy. What might actually happen if you, as a buyer, have a really big carbon ambition, and for instance, you're doing dredging works, and that I would really like this dredging job to be done in a sustainable way, and then your the supplier has two boats, a very clean ship and a dirty ship. And they know the job that they have to do for us, it's maybe 6 hours a day. And they also have another job somewhere in the area where they have to work 20 hours a day. So then what the carbon performance ladder, what it's meant to do is that the contractor thinks, what should I do to reduce carbon performance, to reduce emissions? And then even although we use the carbon performance ladder in the tender procedure, we will not get the clean ship, because the clean ship has more effect on the other job where it is working 20 hours a day instead of a few hours a day at our job. So we don't even want to have a specific carbon goal from ourselves. What we do want is that the organization is thinking about, we are making roads or we're doing dredging work, whatever. We have a general way of doing things, and we are going to put certain extra measures in place in these projects. And we hope to reduce the emissions by 6%, 7%, whatever. So they should make the calculations. They should have their own goal in that project. And also they monitor whether they reach their own goals. So this is it's more like a quality system. Then there's the system where we think, oh, we want to have 7%. No, because I think the way of doing it this way, in the end, we get more results with less cost, because we give the freedom to the contractors to use their brains.
Maud, please.
Yes, thank you, Harold, for explaining that. I think in addition to that, and the question about how is it audited, so the auditor is just not any person. They have to be trained very well. They are part of a certifying institution, and that certifying institution is also accredited by a council for accreditation. So in the Netherlands and in Belgium, we have a government organization that does that. So it's like the ISO standard governance. You can think about it that way. So that means that an auditor, they have to have knowledge not only about, of course, the CO2 performance ladder, but also about that certain kind of company they are auditing. So if they have no experience within a certain sector, for instance, the infrastructural sector, they are not allowed to do audits in that sector and audit that company. So it makes the whole accreditation part of the CO2 performance ladder, make sure that there is a really good knowledge about carbon emissions, footprint, how things are monitored in combination with the carbon management system, and only those auditors are allowed to do these assessments.
Thanks very much. Anyone else on the topic of auditing?
Yes, I want to, the auditing is not very different from the ISO audits, and the audit criteria are described in the manual and will be checked during the external audit. So it's a normal audit procedure.
Just like to turn it now back to the pilot projects in Belgium, and we'd be curious to know about any other ideas or insights about getting started and what it takes to find partners who are willing to get started with pilot projects, either from, from the company side and also indeed from the roads agency. Any other thoughts, comments, tips from either of you for other European contexts that might be interested, other European jurisdictions that might be interested in doing something similar to what you've been doing?
Well, we had a lot of help from the CO2 Logic. There was a consultant. They took a lot of things in their own hands and organized the steering group meetings and were president of them. And so, yeah, we asked a lot of questions to them. And if they didn't know, then we had a lot of help from SKAO as well. So thanks to SKAO for their time. They were a big help. Of course, you need a lot of goodwill, and it helps if your government already decides to have the pilot project. So that's then you have to do it. Good lobbying to the government. That's always a good idea. Yeah.
Yes, Maud, you'd like to add something?
Yes, thank you. I completely agree, Dirk. I think for a dissemination, if you start somewhere in a new country or in a new region, I think it's really good to include all the stakeholders that might be working with this instrument. So it's not only a top-down approach and inform procuring parties to use this instrument, but it's also really important to inform the companies and to communicate with them if there's a potential pilot coming up or not, and how long this pilot will be going on and stuff like that. So I think communication with all the stakeholders is really important. And I think from the procuring parties, you need to have a brave organization or a brave sustainable leader that's willing to take this step, because hopefully you've heard so much information on this webinar. And I think all of us were saying it's not difficult to do so, but you have to just do it. And let's get started. So that's why we call this webinar, Let's Get Started. You just have to do it. But there's a lot of risk aversion, especially in procuring professionals, that might slow down the innovation and taking this step. So where are the brave leaders that want to take this forward?
Great message. Harold, over to you.
Yeah, because to the point of risk aversion, this whole thing started for the rail authority because some companies that did invest in more sustainable way of working complained to the buyers that they were being compared on the same level. They said, we have invested, we are doing really better things than our competitors, and you're only looking at price. And you are making all kinds of policy claims that you think carbon is important. So why don't you use that difference? It is clear that we are better from the carbon perspective than the other guys. So the lobbying, I think, can really start with companies that are doing extra things, telling to their clients, we are better than the other guys, and please use that difference in procurement. And then you can start the discussion about how are you going to do that. But first, the principal question, please distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys. Use the difference in procurement. And then when you get that discussion going, that people say, yes, we are, basically, we would be willing to use the difference. Then I think the carbon performance ladder is an easy way to use in procurement. But yeah, I think you have to get that discussion first. Are you really willing to give more jobs to people that are delivering more quality than people that are just being cheap? And I'm not saying that more sustainable companies are more expensive, because we've actually seen overall that just the better organized companies are both more efficient and more sustainable, so they don't have to be more expensive.
Thanks very much. Just going to squeeze every opportunity out of these last 5 minutes we had. I wanted to ask you to maybe say a quick word about, Harold, as well, about the kind of post-award dialogue and the importance of that in Rijkswaterstaat's approach and use of the ladder. And then, yes, we'll see if we have time, but please, if you can say what about that.
Because I think the same as happened with us as in Belgium, in the beginning, it was voluntary for project people. So we had to, can you test this? Can you do this? This sort of pilot phase. But then we sold it to the organization as this is easy. You just put the things in the contract documents, and then once a year you get the certificates, it's done. And then the project people said, okay, then it's fine. So we don't get too much trouble with it. As long as we get the certificates at the end of the year, it's fine. But then they got frustrated because they said, yeah, now we want to know what they're doing in my project. And they say, okay, that's fine. You know that they offered a certain level of carbon performance. So now it's completely fair that you ask them, what then are you doing in my project? So although from the legal sort of contractual side, you only have the once a year, the obligation to show the proof. But once you know that this system is in place, it is really important that buyer and seller together are discussing measures that you can take, and that the contractor says, by the way, I want to do things a little bit differently so I can save carbon emissions. Do you allow that? So then carbon becomes a legal, so it's safe to discuss carbon once you start using the system, but it is not obligated. If you are a project manager, you just put it in there, give me the certificate once a year, then I'm fine. That's also fine. Well, actually, we don't think it's fine, but we want the discussion, the dialogue between the contractor and the authority to really be also about carbon. And then people are interested in what the other people are doing.
Frankie, any thought about this topic of dialogue either before or after an award, the procurement award, from your company perspective?
Yes, first of all, I want to mention that by using the CO2 Performance Ladder, it has become a major part of our sustainable strategy. So that's a good thing. So we are dealing with a few issues now. The involvement in the design phase. So the majority of the sustainable is determined in the design phase. So it could be a big issue that we have impact on that, and then the strong weight on the price it's also difficult to have sustainable solutions when we have that. And also that was also in the presentation, the total the entire life cycle is important to have also view of the management and the maintenance in the project, that it's included, that we can deal with those risks. And then sustainable is working together with all parties of the value chain. So it's government, clients, contractors, subcontractors, partners, and so on. So that are the most important things that I want to share.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're coming towards the end, and I believe we've addressed most questions, unless the speakers have any things they'd really like to flag. I think we've been able to go through most of the questions, either in the Q&A function or the chat or live. So I want to thank the participants for joining and for posing their questions. And I especially want to thank our speakers today for sharing your knowledge, sharing your experience, and doing it so thoroughly. And so as a final message, I'd just like to say that it's 2022. It's essential that we support contracting authorities to make bold steps on climate action. So best of luck to all the members of our audience in taking lessons from today and applying them in your own jurisdictions in some way or another. Please do not hesitate to be in touch. You'll have our contact information in the follow-up to this webinar. And best of luck. Thanks for joining. Take care, everyone.